Okay, so first questions about the tafsir. Surah Zalzalah or any of the other surah that were covered.
I have a question. I was interested to know, um, did they understand what an atom was when the surah was revealed, or what about the atom did they understand?
That's a good question.
Do you want to? Let's take a couple questions.
Okay.
Go ahead, Anthony.
I remember when I encountered this verse when I first converted, and I guess I kind of read it in light of what I understood of Surah Al-Rahman about the Mizan. And the thing that struck me when I read it when I first converted was, I don't know if I misunderstood this surah, just basically in light of the tafsir we just heard, but I always understood it as the earth chatting with Allah, not about what people were doing on it, but what people were doing to it. And maybe that's a modern understanding, giving in light of certain ecological impending disasters. And so I'm wondering, like, if historically there was an understanding that would have allowed that reading of this surah.
That's a good question.
Can the question be also including the hadith commentary, like something about the hadith? So, with regards to reading the hadith and then finding something that's troubling or like that, couldn't we kind of sign it off relatively easily because it contradicts clear passages in the Quran about the Jews, the Christians, the Sabians, whoever does good and forbids evil or something like that, they don't have need to worry in the hereafter, and then it just kind of conflicts with the whole notion of accountability, the nature of accountability itself, which is intrinsic to Islam. So therefore, like the hadith, it didn't, like when you read it, it didn't sound to me like this would be something the Prophet would say, just by being kind of familiar with let's say the parameters of the thinking in the Quran. So like the new generation, or whatever, not the new generation, but the people that are easily convinced by things online or something like that. I mean, just get to know the Quran, and then you can filter through that prism.
Well, I'll take Khalid's questions first. That's a good point. This is it's very, even, everything has historical depth, and that very debate is anchored in history, because there, on the one hand, those, and I think it was a much clearer understanding in Islamic history that hadith, regardless of the Islam, if it conflicts with the teachings of the Quran, then it cannot be accepted. The problem, though, is that Ahl al-Hadith, and this would be very consistent, by the way, was an Usuli position, because the Usuli judged hadith isnadan wa matnan per the Quran and the morality of the Quran. Excuse me. But Ahl al-Hadith, they two things that were quite problematic. One is that they sometimes even went as far as saying that the hadith can abrogate the Quran, not the lafz but the hukm of the Quran. So that's one. The other thing that was quite problematic is that the doctrine of taqeed, that they argued, for instance, on this issue, that the Christians and Jews are an exception to the rule, that the kuffar, those who don't believe in Allah, that none of their good deeds will count for anything. and they consider that Allah has created an exception for Christians and Jews because they're still believers. And while that position, it subhanAllah, it really didn't re-emerge as a serious contender in the world of ideas until the modern age. And I've noticed that it has become quite influential among the Ahl al-Hadith, among the Sunnah, i.e. the Wahhabis, and the Akhbaris among the Shia. So even today, if you go to a lot of imams and mosques and a lot of graduates of Saudiya or the Hawza and so on, they'll tell you, oh no, if you're a kafir, none of your good deeds will count for anything. And they actually accept that. They believe that. Which, from an Usuli perspective and from my perspective, is not just contradicts other hadiths, like the hadith I cited, that regarding whether you're a mu'min or a kafir, of course your good deeds will count for something, and of course you'll be responsible per the sharia of kawn, the laws of creation, the laws of nature. So for instance, if you bury your daughter, as the people, and the debate in Islamic theology was often around the issue of wa'd al-banat, killing your daughters, which the pre-Islamic Arabs would sacrifice their daughters to Allah by burying their daughters alive, in the belief that their souls go to Lat, which is a Greco-Roman female god, who wants to keep the souls of the daughters, and in return, as a gift, she will give those who sacrifice their daughters a boy. That's the story of Wa'd al-Banat, is that they believe that they're giving the soul to Lat, this Greco-Roman female god, and that she would reward them by giving them a boy in return. And then the debate among Muslim theologians was, well, these people, yes, it was before Islam, but they're still killing their daughters. And even if they believe that this was authorized by Allah, they argued that still their fitrah should have told them that murdering their children is immoral, and that they would be responsible regardless of good, their good faith, so to speak, belief. And what I find very troubling is those modern Muslims who go back to this debate and they say, well, you can't really talk about haram and halal before Islam. Of course you can. There's a certain... So, and the reason I cite this is because I went on the net and I wanted to see what some of the pontificating websites are saying about Zalzalah, because sometimes they talk about surahs, and then I was really shocked that they were citing these hadith al-Tabari, that all the late tafsirs, the Qurtubi and al-Razi and Ibn Adil and so many of the Shanqiti, Tafsir al-Qushayri and so on, they had rejected centuries ago, and suddenly in the modern age you're finding these, I call them net punks, punks on the net, are citing again simply because they have access to Tabari's tafsir translated. But I completely agree with you. I mean, a rational human being would say, this is inconsistent with our most basic notions of justice and inconsistent with the text and the spirit of the Quran, that Allah repeatedly told us that the good deeds, that jaza'ul ihsan al-ihsan, that the reward of good deeds is good. And that whatever wrongdoing or evil deed, the consequence must be in kind. So no, I agree with you, but it's sad that I find that simple anchor of faith is lost among so many young Muslims. Um, and then of course the um, I've read enough. Unfortunately, I've read so much Islamophobic literature that it has. Sometimes I feel like it has rotted in me, because it's this stuff is so lethal and so. I mean, it's like the type of stuff. The value of reading. Like I've read a lot of anti-Semitic Nazi literature. Well, of course, starting with Mein Kampf, but then, and the same type of hate has a certain lethal taste that's unmistakable. It's unmistakable, regardless of where it's coming from. The type of broad characterizations and so on. So, I mean, I found that Islamophobes, of course, cite not the one from Aisha, or one that attributed to her, but one of the versions, Robert Spencer had found it and repeats it, like, look at these Muslims and so on. The point about the earth, as far as I know, the ecological perspective, I have not, I mean, in its modern terms. However, there is something very close, and that is the notion of ifsad fil ard, corrupting the earth, or corruption on earth. And in especially tafsir that have an Sufi bent to them, whether they're Sufi or Sufi bent, like Tafsir al-Jilani and others, and Shanqiti and so on, the Andalusian tafsir, because the Andalusian Mufassirun, they're actually their own school of thought. I mean, someone should write a book on the tafsir that was written by Andalusians. And it's very interesting because the theme of the earth complaining to Allah, and complaining to Allah, I mean, one of the most powerful images that stuck with me is that the earth will complain to Allah about every tree that was cut needlessly. And that comes very close to what you're saying. Last night I couldn't relocate it, but I remember reading it in the past. I just didn't have time. And anyway, my tafsir was Sharif is sleeping, and I didn't want to wake him up, so I didn't want to storm in. And so, but there was one about one of the tafsirs mentioned that, for instance, in Andalusia, where someone apparently had ruined a pond. There was a natural pond, water source, and I don't know what that person, it wasn't clear from, or I couldn't remember exactly what happened. Basically the pond became corrupted and unusable. You couldn't water vegetation. And so he said, for instance, in the hereafter, the earth will complain about how the pond was ruined. So that's very, of course, that imagery is extremely powerful. The earth and then in Sufi poetry, they say that the earth will sing a song of lamentation and a hymn of sadness to Allah about all that human beings have done on it, and all the blood that has been spilled, and all the. One of my favorites is the way Bilal was tortured, and then so it was an Andalusian tafsir, It said that, for instance, the earth will complain to Allah about every Muslim, every oppressed human being, like Bilal, who was tortured and their blood flowed on the earth and their tears dripped on the earth. It was a very powerful poetic imagery, and it was a poem. Uh, they often will quote poetry in the midst of tafsir and so on. Imagine if that ethical norm is rekindled in the Islamic imagination and the Muslim imagination, because that it's a powerful way of relating to justice, and that the earth will remember everything, and space will remember everything, and there will be an accounting, and all of it will be revealed. It's a very powerful moral image, and I think it would resonate with every oppressed human being on the face of this earth. Okay, now the atom. This is a very interesting point, because what was referred to as an atom pre-Islamic was, apparently there was a type of ant that was very, very small, and it couldn't be seen with the naked eye. But they could see the effect of this ant, and that's originally what they refer to as an atom. But then this is in the earliest poetry, and in Lisan al-Arab and Taj al-Arus and so on, it says that this is in the pre-Islamic poetry. When they say dharra, this is what they're referring to. But then we don't know about the first couple of centuries, except that the very early commentaries on the Quran, like Tafsir Muqatil and so on, he says that Zarra is not necessarily an ant, but could be the speck of dust that you see is floating in the air and can only be observable when the sun shines on it. So, then in later tafsir, meaning tafsir written after so we're talking about the Hijri, it would be 6 Hijri, so 12 AD. There's Hasan al-Haytham and the father of optics and so on, they knew that there was something smaller than the smallest thing, but they said they would refer to it as Zarra, but they did not know its nature. So it would say, we don't know its nature, but we know that there's something that from which reality, even the speck of the dust is formed from. And so you find in these late tafsir, when they say dharra, they'll say, well, it is something so small that its nature cannot be described. So it's very interesting, and I'm always interested in the evolution of language, because language is a living thing, and the Quranic revelation. It's remarkable how the language can continue having a power for every day and age. And rightfully so. I mean, so for instance, even if the ecological perspective never existed, part of keeping the Quran alive is to imbue it with that ecological perspective within a new epistemological framework. And I think that's part of taking the Quran seriously. And when we stop doing that, then we allow the Quran to remain like a historical curiosity But yeah, these are um, very interesting points, and it you know, the thing that I covet the most through these halaqas is to put in people's heart a passion for the Quran, because it just I always feel like I am going to reach the end of my life, and there is so much about this book that I would have loved to study, and there's simply no time to, because there's just so much, and it is truly a wondrous book, and it irritates me that so much time has to be spent investigating things merely for the purpose of defensive purposes, because the issue of uh, pre-Islamic saj'a or pre-Islamic poetry re-emerges in the modern age. I mean, and this way we keep going in circles. We don't move ahead, which is very frustrating.
Can I
Okay.
add something?
Yeah.
So I know that this sort of focuses a lot on the wrong that is done will bear weight and have gravity in ways that we don't understand. And being the optimist, it's also true for the good things that are done. And
Absolutely.
we have the ability to transform even those bad things that happened even to us by doing good. And I think that's a good thing to focus on in terms of how Muslims can move forward.
And actually the Quran says exactly that al-hasanat tumhi sayyi'at, that the good deeds will have the power to erase the bad deeds. It's like a disinfectant.
Yeah.
And so if you want a formula, I mean, among you open once you open like the books of the Sufi tradition, the Sufis always would give the same advice for all the disciples, because you're talking about Sufis were accustomed to being approached by people who had suffered a great deal in their lives. And some of the suffering, like when you, for instance, read some of the narratives about what happened in the Mongol invasions in Baghdad, or even like crusades in El Fayoum, and the mass rapes they committed and so on. And I'm always and it would be interesting to get like the response of psychologists on this. And the Sufi literature always has the same response. You want to heal the pain inside of your heart. There's only one way to heal it, and that's by doing good things to erase the bad things that was done to you. So it's literally acts of kindness that will heal the pain in your soul. So, and that was even the response, which was pretty straightforward looking when you think about it. I mean, when the Crusades came to Fayoum and they raped so many women, that a lot of them were pregnant, was the children of Crusaders. And till now, a lot of like you find blue-eyed, blonde-haired people in Fayoum, well, they're the descendants of the invaders. And at the time, Fayoum was predominantly Sufi. And so, of course, the traditional Fayoumi families, it's like our daughters have been raped and by these foreigners, and they are pregnant. And what prevented the bloodshed of either families killing their daughters, although it's not their fault, obviously, or even aborting the children, it was the Sufi masters. Because the Sufis constantly said, you want to heal the effects of the rape, raise the child, and raise the child lovingly. And that's the way you're going to heal the effect. And that's why all these children were born in Fayoum. And that's why till today, when you visit Fayoum, you find the descendants of, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids. It's really, yeah.
That's can you talk also, like you've said this in other places about how Sufi Muslims were 9% Sufi before this, just to emphasize this and how most people converted through Sufism, just to kind of dispel that.
Well, this is just a historical fact. Sufism was the predominant form of Islam until the colonial era, and it actually, and the reason it was resisted during colonialism is because most of the groups fighting colonialism, like Senusiyya and Qadariya and so on, they were Sufi groups. And so there was a lot of colonial interest in destroying Sufism, which coupled later on was the discovery of oil and the birth of the Salafi movement and so on. And the idea that Sufism hampered modernity, which is adopted by Ataturk and so on, which is, but the spread of Islam, in places like Indonesia and Philippines and China and so on, it was all through the vehicle of Sufism. That these were the people who spread Islam. And I talked about this, I think I talked about it in the race class, that most converts in these areas and in Africa as well, it wasn't by missionary. People didn't normally convert in mass because of rational conversations. It was through the participation in the activities of Sufis, the dances, the music, so you go and join a Sufi dance and you fall in love with Islam. That's an entire history that's what race is referring to, which she's heard me talk about so many times. But it's I still think that the biggest the source of converts in the West is Sufism.
Go ahead. And then,
It's somewhat of like a philosophical question. So I think I don't necessarily struggle with this, but I think in modern epistemology, it's really hard to express the idea that there's a frame of reference outside of human materiality. And so even if we were to go with the ecological perspective, like from a Quranic perspective, that doesn't mean anything if you don't even have the ability to even conceive of the possibility of something outside of the materiality, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that one of the problems that I see with it's usually actually born Muslims, it's not converts, is and obviously the general population, particularly here in Western California, is like the epistemology is such that like this can't even be a thing, like a frame of reference outside of human materiality, anything like that. And so I'm curious, like, and maybe this is kind of like a loaded philosophical question. If it is, I apologize, but I feel like without that frame of reference, or without even that idea, well, really most of the Quran is just it doesn't mean very much, if anything at all. And so how can one approach just living in the modern world, particularly the modern West, where that is the dominant epistemology, basically neo-Darwinianism, materialism, all of that stuff that renders the ethical message of Zalzalah like totally like moot. Because if without that, you're just left with, we have this world, we should just take care of it. But there are no ethical consequences for, dumping a bunch of oil in the ocean, other than the material consequences that arise thereof, right? we have to, I think as Muslims we're supposed to think beyond that. So yeah, there are
Yeah.
those ecological consequences, but even in terms of Zalzalah, there's a moral consequence to that as well.
Do you want me to answer or wait?
I thought there was another.
Khalid, go ahead.
I'm trying to think how to exactly formulate the question, but when you brought up the example of the orphan child who became some kind of like dictator, and then he was like the most horrific. He did horrific things because of by virtue of his being an orphan and whatnot, and that the parents will be accountable, or like our actions and future consequences of our actions that we'll be accountable for. There's a bit of, I guess, predeterminism in that, because we like beyond the orphan child who lost the parents, for example, from some murder, what they become is like the murderer is the one that's going to be accountable, but yet you don't know really what the potential of that child is, and then reconciling that, for example, with even though it was a divinely inspired act according to the Surah, and Surah Al-Kahf with the sage that takes Moses and tells him that he knows things, or he was guided to do things that Moses couldn't have any knowledge of, and how he killed the boy of the parents, killed the child, obviously, saddening to the parents, but then because somehow this child was destined to what is the expression in the verse where it says that he's going to be a burden on his parents, or
he's
he's
going to be he's going to torment
their parents or something like that. So there's like this intrinsic nature that's potentially predestined into the individual and what their potential will be. It's just I'm trying to reconcile the two.
Yeah, I mean, so, okay, I'll take Khalid's point first. The Surah Al-Kahf and Fajr and so on, put that on the side, because that raises, that is an entire discussion in itself, and it raises a lot of issues. If Allah wills, inshallah, we'll get to it, and it's I just want to say that there's a difference between accountability and what you will see when yara. Just because you will see the full consequences of your good deeds and bad deeds, it doesn't necessarily mean you will be punished for what you see in full. What I think is most interesting is that when Muslim theologians started talking about this issue, something very similar to the idea of foreseeability in the common law tradition emerged, that what you are accountable for is what you could have foreseen. So if a rational person in your position could have foreseen the consequences, then, but the painful thing that even what you are not accountable for because you could not have foreseen, you're gonna still see the full consequences. And then the horrific thing is, in fact, seeing the full consequences. As much as there are things that, I might do something good, and what results from this something, the good deed that I've done is something that I could not have even possibly foreseen or intended, is going to make me very happy to see all the good things that come out of it, even if I don't get rewarded for everything, because some of it might be due to things that completely were unpredictable. So this idea of predictability and foreseeability, it plays a big role in moral accountability, aside from just strict causality, which but it is important that part of understanding, because part of being rewarded or punished is for us to understand fully why is it fully just and fair that one be rewarded and punished for their behavior? And seeing the full consequences of our actions, it's going to be a thoroughly humbling and thoroughly thrilling experience, depending. So the issue of Khidr and so on raises, because Khidr is like, for instance, it's with Moses, there's a whole literature and a whole discussion, and we start talking about the rationalist tradition, the Sufi tradition, the tradition that said that this is just something limited to the Israelites, and I mean, inshallah, like like we did Surah Al-Rahman, maybe when Allah wills, maybe we should do Surah Al-Kahf out of order. The point that Anthony raised, this is the entire tension between Western materialistic civilization, even within its religious traditions, because even if the religious traditions are still quite materialistic, and a lot of nativist cultures, because when you think even native cultures, Native Americans, or whether it's the ones that were wiped out by Spanish colonialism or Portuguese colonialism, or a lot of African cultures, what was the most important thing is that they saw beyond just these material consequences, and they considered the earth a living thing, and they had a relationship with nature and with the cosmos, and they were able to see beyond the simply empirical, and Darwinism itself. I mean, and the consequences of Darwinism on the human psychology is a fairly recent thing, and it's really a product in the same way that the science of race, so-called science of race, because it's not really science, is a very, so I mean, in many ways races were invented just only really in the 17th and 18th century. Before that, we really didn't have a concept of a race. And I mean, I don't know other than to say that Islam doesn't make sense if one does not work hard to understand that material existence is but, it's as if one, and that's what I often tell people, is it's as if you are focusing all your attention on this 5% in which material world exists in, and we know that 95% is not occupied by the material world in which we exist. And we also know that everything we deal with is within these very limited dimensions, while cumulative evidence tells us now that there are so many other dimensions that we don't engage. And so the civilizational paradigm itself that focuses on such a limited sphere is an incoherent paradigm. Now, what will it take to shake this paradigm off its foundations, and for people to really but I completely agree with you that this doesn't seem to be a problem with converts. It seems to be a problem with born Muslims who really epistemologically are part of the Western civilization, and they struggle to be real Muslims in the way a convert is, because they struggle to keep in mind that even the idea that when Allah tells us that real life is the life that starts after death or after resurrection, not the life that you have right now, And yeah, sure, most born Muslims have the hardest time internalizing this. But if you should be focusing in your prayers on anything, that's exactly what you should be focusing on. I mean, and that's why it's like I always say to Muslims, it's like, you know, if you just if you focus on your prayers and what you need to focus on, it will keep you plenty busy. And you don't need to go into, you know, all these people that write grace and so on. You know, I say, go focus on your prayers on what you're supposed to be focused on. Try to internalize the idea that before you know it, you will go from your 20s when you know, you're a little punk, and then before you know it, you're in your 60s and you're starting to think about when will the moment of death comes. And then it's you will come to know. That's what the Quran says. You know, you will know for certain, and that's, you know, that's a challenge between the believers and the wishy-washy or unbelievers, is that we basically are saying that moment when you're going to say, "Oops, it all turned out to be real." Life after death or after resurrection actually turns out to have been deadly seriously real. The entire challenge is we're going to say it's going to happen, and your doubts are going to be very silly at that moment. You know, the memory of your doubts are going to be very silly, and you know, it's modern psychology is difficult because that's not where, you know, the idea, and I even sense it between even someone like, you know, raised in the family that I was raised in, where, you know, from the time we were very children, you know, little kids were constantly being drilled in us by our parents that think about the consequences in the hereafter, and the way that children are raised here, where, you know, the hereafter is really an afterthought. God, you guys are not like cops.
Yo, don't say cops.
Thank you.
They can just put it on the table.
Put it on the table, please.
Yeah, so it's 8 o'clock. So
Yeah, no, we should wrap up. So.
Okay. Any just 10 minutes. Any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I was wondering about Maria Al-Katiba and her status of whether, I mean, I've heard that she was the wife of the Prophet, and then I've heard that she wasn't. And I was just wondering some clarity on that.
Maria the Coptic was absolutely a wife of the Prophet. All the reports about, I mean, all the reports about the Prophet having concubines or slaves died in the Islamic civilization, because Allah says in the Quran that the greatest act of charity is to free your slave, and this is what scholars said a long time ago, and the Prophet was known for giving every act of sadaqah he did. So it was inconceivable that he would continue holding on to slaves when he's constantly teaching his community that if you want to earn favor with Allah, free your slaves. So a long time ago, scholars looked at the reports that said that people like Maria the Copt was freed, and in fact was not only freed, she was freed and given an option to return to her family, and she refused to return to her family. And there's a famous story where her family sends especially her father, sends her brother down to Mecca and to basically appeal to her after she was freed to come with them back to Egypt, and she refuses. And scholars examine the isnad of stories like that, and the isnad that ignored stories like that, and centuries ago said that the Prophet never held on to concubines. The first time that the stories of the Prophet holding on to slaves resurface again was with first French and German Orientalists. And that literature is maddeningly selective because they completely ignore a narrative. Reports about the Prophet, for instance, manumitting Maria the Coptic, giving her an option to go home, and the whole story about her family sending her brother, and so on and so forth. And or even the famous story about Zainab, who from it's cherry picking upon traditions. The next big resurgence are Islamophobes in the current day and age, and especially, and I mentioned this before, when Bernard Lewis noticed that the African movement, the second resurrection, when black Americans were seeing Islam as a source of liberation and converting in large numbers to Islam, and this is the whole the time of Waraquddin Muhammad and Malcolm X and so on, and then Bernard Lewis wrote his book Islam and Slavery, rekindling the old Orientalist themes, which are quite absurd, that the Arabs were engaged in slave trade on racial basis, while in truth, I mean, and this is another issue, but in truth, the entire idea of race was a modern invention, and slave trade that was engaged in, whether by Arabs or Africans, was not, I mean, it was far from racially based, as anyone that studied the Mamluks' history knows. But anyway, so the idea that the Prophet held on to slaves, it resurfaced after, and not just, and I can even pinpoint that it was after the Bosnian genocide. And it blows my mind that so many people have written refuting Bernard Lewis and his students about slavery and the Prophet, and yet the same material. So, for instance, there is a book called The Truth About the Prophet. It was written in response. Damn it, I have it up here. I forget. There was a book written by Islamophobe attacking the Prophet Muhammad, and that book was written in response. Do you know what I'm talking about?
You don't remember who wrote it?
No, I'm trying to remember the name of the Islamophobic book. It was the Islamophobic book was by Robert Spencer. Anyway, although that fellow who wrote actually a really good response to it and went back and tracked the whole narratives about Prophet and concubines and all of that. When that book first came out, I saw it in Barnes & Noble 1 week, and I bought a copy of the book and read it. I was impressed by it, and then, yeah, and it disappeared among Muslims themselves. So, this is the book that Robert Spencer wrote. Yeah, the book written by the Muslims is a response to that book.
Was it by Karen Armstrong?
No. It was a Muslim guy. It was a Muslim professor.
What's the
Robert Spencer wrote The Truth About Muhammad, and the Muslim guy wrote a response to The Truth About Muhammad. Because in Robert Spencer, The Truth About Muhammad, he talks about the Prophet as a slave holder. And that guy basically goes back and tracks these stories and says, this was debunked ages ago. But of course Muslims didn't support the book and didn't make it profitable. While the Robert Spencer's The Truth About Muhammad sold millions of copies, the Muslim rebuttal, because, and I blame Muslims, I don't blame non-Muslims, because if every decent Muslim would have bought 10 copies of that book just to make it, every average Muslim would have said, I'm going to put in an order for 10 copies of the book. Things would be different. Publishers will get the point. You can make money if you write the right type, if you sell the right type of books. Of course, Muslims just, Anyway, so make a long story short, all the stuff about the Prophet holding on to slaves is garbage. It's not even worth. It's absolute garbage.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much.
Alayhi salam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, everybody.